Victor Nation. How we feeling? JB. Check it out.
If you've been around the channel for a while, you know that this isn't the first time that we are making a timeline for League of Legends. We made the first one before Universe even existed. During these dark times, we had to look for the lore in the client. And in the worst case...
Oh yeah, I only saw Arcane. I know nothing about the game. I tried to play it once and I couldn't get past the tutorial, so...
We had to snoop around the internet because Riot hid their stories on separate websites. And on top of that, half of the champions didn't even have canon story. Then we made the second timeline. That one was released after the Universe launched. There at least we had the base idea of what the story of League of Legends even is. But because we made that video very close to the release of Universe, most of the stories were not fleshed out. And over the following months, some of the details in the story changed. And suddenly that timeline was full of mistakes. And that's why we are making the third and hopefully the last video on the timeline of League of Legends. That's because today Riot released the Realms of Runeterra book, which is an official summary of the entire story of the world of League of Legends. But more importantly, this book also contains the official timeline of this story. And that is what I'm going to show you today. So no more guessing, no more assumptions. What you are about to hear today is set in stone. And the purpose of this video is to give us a guide for the future. So whenever in the future...
I mean, Arcane is not canon. As far as I know, Silco is not a real character. So I know this is not the timeline for Arcane, but you know, with the new Nexus coming out, I just want to know more.
Future, we will need to know when the historical events happened. This video will help us. So, without further ado, let's have a look at the thing the lore community has been waiting for years.
Oh yeah.
The official timeline of Runeterra. Before we start, it is important to note that just like we say that something happened before Christ, because that is how we mark year 0, on Runeterra the foundation of Noxus is year 0. I will talk about it more when we get to it on the timeline. But just remember that when something happened before the year 0, we say that it happened before Noxus.
Also, the new show, Welcome to Nexus, actually that fucking important. Like the place is that important.
So let's start with the very beginning. The official timeline doesn't show the very beginning of everything, but we know that something happened because we got proofs in the stories. So, countless eons ago, Runeterra popped into existence. This was probably around the time when Aurelion started spreading stars around the universe. In fact, the earliest point in the story we have is the beginning of time. This was mentioned in the story Twilight of the Gods, when the Ascended Warriors rode on the Dragons of Twilight to the beginning of times. This was a form of entertainment to the Ascended. Whenever they wanted, they could just jump on the Dragons of Twilight and watch the beginning of everything.
What?
Either way, that is the earliest point in the story. With this, obviously, we have the entire story of the Watchers, where the Watchers are these creatures from another realm. And as stars and planets started appearing in our physical reality, the Watchers, which were these creatures sitting in darkness, suddenly saw light in the distance. And because they enjoyed their sleeping in the darkness and they didn't want to be blinded by annoying light, they decided to silence it. That is the reason why the Watchers are trying to consume our world. They were sleeping in the darkness since the beginning of anything. And when Runeterra popped into existence, it was like an annoying shining light to them. So if anything, we are invading the privacy of the Watchers. Anyway...
Okay, so these godlike beings just want to be left alone. They don't want anyone to put on the light. They want to keep sleeping. That's so relatable. Like I'm on their side. Yeah, destroy Runeterra. Let me keep sleeping.
This sets up the very beginning of the planet. But now let's jump onto the actual history of Runeterra that is written in the book. 9,000 years before Noxus, we have the very first Runeterran story. This era is known as simply the First Lands, which of course is an ancient name for Ionia. So it's not surprising to know where this story takes place. This era is entirely new to us, so pay attention. The description in the book reads: across the island continent known as Ionia, a great war raged between mortals and a race of sky giants. Only by the intervention of the Vastaya Shirei, legendary beings of immense power, existing in both material and spirit realms simultaneously, was victory eventually won. This is interesting because we have never heard about the sky giants before, although they were teased almost years before this book. If you have a look at Universe, you may notice these images with giant swords that have no meaning. Well, they have no meaning because people forgot where these giant swords came from. And the book actually has a special description for this exact image. This is what it says. Titans of the past, It is certain Ionia has much longer and richer history than any living soul could claim to know. Indeed, in the more remote and mountainous highlands, the landscape is still littered with evidence of great wars from ages past. But instead of clearing the ruins, the Ionians chose to respect what remains, even if they no longer fully understand what it represents. So this is a proof that the very first Runeterran story was a war with the giants, which is a war we unfortunately know nothing about. One thing
Yeah, it happens a lot. That's so sad. Like with enough time, even something as monumental as that gets forgotten. Like Elden Ring, when you go around and everything is destroyed, you see weapons just being part of the environment, and you have no idea.
to note is that even for TFT, Riot is using these giant swords for the Ionian maps, so it is clear that Riot might have future plans for this story. But now, let's move on. 8,000 years before Noxus, the War of the Three Sisters. The description of this event tries to set everything on the right track, because previously the story of Freljord had some plot holes. This is what the description says. After they defeated the old gods of the north, a feud developed between the sisters Avarosa, Cyrilda and Lysandra, and quickly escalated into open conflict. The final battle was fought at the gates of Lysandra's citadel, where she sacrificed many allies to entomb her enemies in true ice. This suggests that the Watchers got frozen in the Holding Abyss first, and a couple of years after that, the sisters turned against each other. It wasn't a massive battle that included all three sisters and the Watchers on top of that like we previously thought. In reality, according to the book, it was two separate battles, despite the fact that Lysandra's bio still mentions everyone being frozen in one battle. But then again, the story has these plot holes only in Lysandra's version of the story, and that might be happening because Lysandra is trying to hide the truth. Originally, with this information, I wanted to retell the entire Freljordian story as accurately as possible.
So she's
But
like
it is
the bad
obvious
guy
that
of
Riot
the
has the freedom to
sisters?
tell us more about the Watchers in the future. And with Lysandra being a massive liar, if in the future Riot expanded the story and altered the timeline, it would invalidate this entire video. So instead, just remember that the official timeline mentioned that the sisters defeated the Watchers before they got into conflict.
Okay.
But now, let's move on. 6,000 years before Noxus, a westward migration. Of course, we know this story very well, because it was explained
No
when
idea.
Qiyana was released. This is where the advanced people of Ishtal spread around the world. Some people migrated to the Blessed Isles, some to the
Okay.
Buhuru Islands, and some to Targon, the deserts of Shurima, and to Valoran. In short, nearly all humans on Runeterra come
This
from
is
the Ishtali
very
region.
Orwell.
This is what the description says. Bringing all their ancient knowledge and wisdom with them, settlers from the forgotten lands of the distant east reached the shores of Shurima and Valoran. In time, their descendants would come to rule the greatest civilizations Runeterra has ever known. Notice how the description simply mentions settlers from the forgotten land of the distant east, and how it says that they reached the shores of Shurima and Valoran. Now, Shurima and Valoran are the entire continents, so the story almost suggests that even the people of Ishtal don't come from Ishtal. It suggests that even the people of Ishtal came from somewhere further east. What I'm trying to say is that maybe there is a place further east that is not even on the map. And that is where people came from. They landed on the shores of Shurima and Valoran, and from there they spread around.
Okay.
Next, we have 5,000 years before Noxus,
Yeah, that was
the
simple
rise
enough.
of the God Warriors. Guided by the divine aspects of Targon in preparation for some unknown future war, the ancient Chirimans used
What
the
the
Sun Disk
heck
at
is that?
Neremazeth to create the first Ascended. These noble beings were worshipped as living gods, and the empire they forged would endure for millennia. This confirms that we
Cool.
were right in our previous assumptions that it was the Targonian aspect and possibly even the Celestials themselves who showed Shurimans how to create the Ascended. The first Ascended were made in Neremazeth. However, for unknown reasons, these early experiments with the Ascended failed, and Neremazeth was turned into ruins. So instead, a couple of years later, a better and greater Sun Disk was built in the middle of the Shuriman Desert, which would become the foundation of the future capital city of the Shuriman Empire.
Right,
The
good.
description mentioned that the Ascended were created for unknown future war, which of course, we know
Yeah, someone who only saw Arcane, this it's a bunch of nothing. Like it means nothing to me. I'm sure if you play the game, you know a lot of what they're talking about. I have no idea. I'm
would become
lost.
the Great Void War. 2,500 years before Noxus, Icathia rebelled against Shurima. This is when the story called Where Icathia Once Stood happened. During this story, the Icathian kingdom requested to stay independent from the Shuriman Empire. Obviously, the Emperor of Shurima denied this request, and as an answer, he sent his ascended god warriors to reclaim the rebelling kingdom. And so, because Icathians knew they wouldn't be able to beat the god warriors, they called upon a different kind of power to save them. Or, as the description puts it, in a desperate bid to succate from the tyranny of the Empire, Icathia unleashed the Void in battle. Their own capital city was instantly destroyed, the land tainted and corrupted
Void.
beyond all recognition. Even the mighty ascended
is that?
host could do little to combat this horror, and Shurima was forced to abandon Icathia for good. 2000 years before Noxus, Azir's failed ascension. This is when Zerath betrayed Azir. Some could argue that Azir wasn't
Who?
really betrayed. He just never told Zerath that he wanted to
Oh my god, who? Yo, in other like timeline videos like the 40k, they explain like you don't know what an orc is. They explain, you know, a quick description. This dude is just like this dude and this dude. They betray each other. Like explain a little bit. I have no idea.
free all slaves. Azir wanted to keep it as a surprise which would be announced after his ascension. But since he never told Zerath, Zerath thought that Azir was as cruel as all his ancestors. And so, Zerath decided to push Azir away from the ritual, and he absorbed the power of the Sun Disk himself, forcing it to transcend him beyond what even the Ascended are, and destroying the Empire in the process. The
Okay.
description of these events says, denied godhood by a base act of treachery, the last Shuriman Emperor, Azir, was lost, along with the Sun Disk itself. The people, filled with fear and sorrow, looked for the remaining Ascended to protect them. Something to note here. Notice that there is a 500-year gap between these events and the story of Icathia. Because Azir was just a normal man during these events, that means that it wasn't Azir who led the Empire into war with Icathia. It was likely one of his ancestors. 550 years before Noxus, the Great Darkin War. The last sentence of the previous era mentioned that after Azir died
Yo, I'm just waiting for my Caitlyn to show up.
and the Sun Disk was destroyed, people turned to the Ascended Warriors to protect them. And that was the foundation of the Great Darkin War. For what would a warlord be without an army? Bereft of purpose, and scarred by what they had endured in facing the Void, many of the Ascended became twisted in body and mind, naming themselves Darkin, and raising hordes of mortal warriors to conquer the world.
like
Eventually,
demons.
the aspects who had inspired their creation were forced to intervene, imprisoning the Darkin within their own accursed weapons. In other words,
So it's
after Azir's betrayal, the Ascended War Host was left without a leader, and with Icathia
So they made the first arcane weapons. So they made like the first hex deck.
defeated, they were left without a purpose. Combine that with the fact that the minds of the Ascended were already touched by the Void, and suddenly they went crazy and started hungering for power. Thus, the Ascended became the Darkin. At this point, the situation was out of control, and the living weapons which the Targonian aspects created to fight the Void were now terrorizing humanity. And so, using the power of the moon, the aspects were forced to intervene and imprison the Darkin inside their own weapons.
Cool.
Notice the symbology here. The Darkin were technically created using the power of the sun reflecting in the Sun Disk. At the end, as we learned from the story Twilight of the Gods, they were sealed using the power of the moon. So the sun and the moon are the primal forces here. They are the beginning and the end. 400 years before Noxus, reign
Okay.
of the Iron Revenant. This is when the story of Mordekaiser happens. I'll read the official description first, and then I will fill in the gaps. Deceiving the mages who had resurrected him, the warlord San Uzal was reborn as Mordekaiser, and set about conquering the mortal realm from his immortal bastion. Though it took almost 3 centuries, he was eventually defeated by an alliance of Noxai tribes, who inherited the empire he had built. I need to add 2 things here. First of all, before San Uzal died, he conquered
He looks
Valran
like
and
Sauron.
forged an empire in blood and death. He did this because he believed that if he lived a glorious life in the name of the gods of death, he would be invited to their table in the afterlife. But
Okay.
after he died, he learned that the afterlife is empty. This angered him so much that he learned how to speak the language of the dead, also known as Oknun, by observing other damned souls. Then he reached out to the world of the
Okay.
living, in hopes to bait some sorcerer into bringing this legendary warlord back to life. And with a bit of patience, that is exactly what happened. Mordekaiser is San Uzal
So he is Sauron. He is like the evil overlord who's trying to find someone to revive him.
name spoken in Oknun. After this, the description happens. San Uzal was brought back to life as Mordekaiser and he started a new conquest of the world. However, at the end of the description, it says, he was eventually defeated by an alliance of the Noxai tribes. But of course, we know that it wasn't just a bunch of barbarian tribes who grouped together to take him down. In reality, Mordekaiser was also betrayed by his own people inside the Immortal Bastion, one of which was LeBlanc herself. Anyway, as the story
Oh.
mentioned, almost 300 years passed, and
She's in the Welcome to Naxxas trailer. She kind of reminds me of Tarja from Fire Emblem. Gonna have a similar design.
now we are getting
She
to
looks
25 years before Noxus. The Ruination. A terrible accident occurred in the arcane vaults beneath the city of Helia, hidden away on the Blessed Isles. With the barrier between the mortal and the spirit realms shattered, the souls of the dead were trapped in eternal torment within the coiling black mist, and the newly dubbed Shadow Isles were abandoned by all right-thinking mortals. Of course, everyone knows that the Ruination was caused by the Ruined King. So about 25
Yeah, of course, everyone knows that. Yes. Yeah, You don't have to explain it to, someone new. Nope, everyone knows that.
years before Noxus is when the story of Callista and Hecarim happened. And this takes us to 13 years before Noxus. The Rune Wars. With Helia lost, dangerous magical artifacts soon began to find their way into the wrong hands. On the fields outside Com, the renowned mage Tyrus and his apprentice Rise witnessed the first devastating attack in the Rune Wars. A sight that would haunt Rise's nightmares for the rest of his unnaturally long life. In other words, the story of Rise actually happened after the Ruination. Which makes sense because Master Tyrus, who was responsible for taking care of the World Runes, was from the Blessed Isles. But since the Blessed Isles exploded, it makes sense that suddenly protecting the World Runes was harder. That might be one of the reasons why people around the world started discovering the World Runes. Either way, the description mentions Com, which is a place mentioned on the map of Runeterra. You can't find the place there, but it was mentioned in Rise's story. In fact, it is this exact image. The reason why you can't find it on the map is because it is speculated that this entire crater in the middle of the sea is this place. There used to be a massive chunk of land there, but as the story of Rise described, the mountains got evaporated and the ocean rushed into the land. That's where this giant hole comes from, the former birthplace of Rise. And finally, we are getting to year 0, Noxus
Final.
endures. The Rune Wars escalated across most of the known world. After a decade of almost apocalyptic battle, the last of the Noxai were forced to retreat inside the Immortal Bastion for shelter from the magical fallout. When they finally emerged, the land beyond has been ravaged, but they survived. They were alloyed as a single people, no longer Noxai, but Noxus, and have marked their calendar from
Okay.
this day ever since. The story here reveals something interesting. Just like some people fled to the forests of Demacia, decades before Demacia was even a kingdom, because the forest itself was able to protect them from magic. People who were on the other side of the continent wouldn't be able to make it there, and so instead they hid inside the Immortal Bastion. And because the Immortal Bastion was empowered by the dark magic of Mordekaiser, it's not a surprise to know that the Immortal Bastion could also protect them from magic. So if you think about it, Demacia and Noxus started during the same event. However, it would take Demacia much longer to get actually kickstarted. Which takes us to the year 292, the Demacian Crown. Far to the west, the nation founded by the great champion Orlon crowned
Okay.
its first king. Originally settled by the refugees of the Rune Wars, it was declared that Demacia would be a sanctuary from magic, now and forevermore. Of course, if you want to know more about Orlon, the person who founded Demacia, you can read the story of Poppy, who is now wielding the Hammer of Orlon. Interestingly enough, the foundation of Demacia
Oh,
is
that's a
also
cool
tied to
character.
other stories. For example, this means that it was around the year 300 when the story of Kael and Morgana happened. Next we get to the year 349. Noxus becomes an imperial power. After a series of
Okay,
forced
cool.
annexations and the fall of the Draken Gate, the strength
So this is like Rome, right? This is like the Rome of the Arcane universe.
of Noxus grew to match its ambitions. The noble houses swore, though it might take 1,000 years, to unify all nations of Runeterra beneath a single banner, and elected a Grand General to lead their war hosts to victory. This part is super interesting, because this means that Noxus was founded with the exact same philosophy as Demacia. Demacia was also founded with the idea of having a shelter for all races of Runeterra. But as time went on, that idea corroded.
Yep.
But Noxus stuck with it. To this day, Noxus is still the most diverse nation on Runeterra, and that's because they stuck with their base philosophy. Then we have the
W
year
Empire.
772, Tragedy on the River Pilt. Merchant clans controlling the trade routes between Valorant and Shurima accelerated construction of vast accessways and conveyors. However, excavations of these sun gates undermined the ancient port of Zone, plunging whole portions of the city into the lightless caverns beneath. In other words, before the year 772, the only way to transport goods by ship from east to west would be to go around the entire continent, because the path through the continent was blocked by rocks right here, which is where the ancient city of Zone was. Back then, Zone was a Shuriman city, and its ancient name was Oshrava Zone. However, the rich people realized that if they make a massive hole through the rocks, instead of going around the entire continent, they could go through the rocks and pass between the eastern and western Valoran with ease. And so the construction began, and the merchants of Zone started digging a hole through the rocks. But because it was taking far
So this is like Panama. It's like the Panama Canal.
too long to do that, they decided to accelerate the digging, and so they used explosives. The issue is that they miscalculated how many of these explosives they needed, and the explosion was so big half of the city sank into the waters below.
Yikes.
This disaster was so massive thousands of people died that day, and the city was effectively split into two halves. Zone remained as it was below, albeit being mostly in ruins,
Oh.
but above that a new city was born. It was called Piltover, for it was now sitting over the river Pilt.
So the whole story of Arcane happens because they use too many explosives. That's why. That's why there's two wars and two cities because they use too many explosives. Oh my god.
Next we have the year 787. With more and more bedraggled fortune seekers washing up on their shores, missionaries from the Buhuru granted these Paelengi outsiders refuge in the southern island base. While there were many years of cultural confusion, even including the name of the Serpent Isles, this settlement would eventually grow into a bustling port city in its own right.
That looks
In
beautiful.
other words, the Buhuru were these advanced
Yeah, it looks like if you ever play Dark Souls 2, you know, the underground area with the boats and the water. It looks like it.
religious people that came here from
The one
Ishtal,
with the
just like
pirate
they came
ship.
to the Blessed Isles. But as more and more outsiders, who they called Paelengi, came to their islands, most of them coming from Piltover and Zone and usually seeking some form of treasures, the Buhuru gave them their own island where they could do whatever they wanted. And over time, as more and more people came, a settlement was built there, and that was eventually turned into Bilgewater. Next we have the year 984, the invasion of Ionia. Following many years of scouting and preparation, Grand General Borem Darkwill ordered a large-scale occupation of Ionia by Noxian forces. Although initially met with little resistance, the Warhost's brutal advancement across the provinces soon gave rise to fierce retaliations from various Ionian militias, which became more organized after the infamous Battle of the Placidium. Of course, everyone knows the invasion of Ionia.
Of course, everyone knows it.
The story of most Ionian champions and a lot of Noxian champions as well explain this. So if you want to learn about what happened here, Irelia is the centerpiece. But other interesting champions include Riven, Kayn, Master Yi, and even Zed and Shen.
I need to find. I'm gonna react to another video where they actually explain the timeline. This feels like it's for, you know, already players who are big fans, not for, you know, newcomers who only saw Arcane.
But of course there is one more champion who changed because of these events. And that champion takes us to the last point on this timeline. Year 989. Jericho Swain seizes Noxus. In spite of his dishonorable discharge from the military, former General Swain enacted a coup with the Noxian capital,
What the fuck is that pose? He looks so evil, but like so fabulous. Like, what the fuck?
disposing and killing Borem Darkwill. In less than a year, Swain had ended the occupation of Ionia, vastly reduced the influence of the noble houses, and established the Triforce
Yo, this dude is like a JoJo villain. He's like posing every time.
Council to govern the empire. Of course, the Triforix is the new way Noxus is led. Instead of having one Grand General who acts as a tyrant, and who could also be easily corrupted, Swain made it a law that Noxus would always be led by 3 people, each representing one pillar of Noxus: vision, might, and guile. That way, with 3 leaders in charge, Noxus could never be corrupted. And this takes us to the present
Oh,
days.
wait,
Arc.
hold up.
Noxus could never
Oh shit, that's the crow from the end of Arcane Season 2. Also, that's this dude.
be
Ah.
corrupted. And this takes us to the present days. Because even though this is the end of the official timeline, there are stories that are happening right now. The biggest one is the story of Silas, who is currently pushing the story of Demacia forward in the present days. But other present stories also include the story of Udyr and Volibear, the one where Udyr faced the Earth Sign, but also we have the stories of Raven and Yasuo, called Confessions of a Broken Blade, and even Jin's escape. Because remember, even though the story of Jin, Zed and Yasuo starts before the invasion of Ionia, between then and now, Jin was imprisoned and then he was freed. So during the present days, Zed and Shen are still hunting down Jin. But that is it for the official timeline of Runeterra. Finally, there should be no mistakes and this video should serve as a guide for years to come.
Yeah. Yeah, this one was a mistake.
I strongly doubt that right
I was expecting, I need to find another video. I was expecting, real explanation. He didn't mention Victor once, or Vi, or Caitlyn. I was just waiting for it. Like, I knew I wouldn't get a lot of things being just an Arcane fan, but he explained nothing. Like, all I got from that was the reason the Silco exists because someone used too many explosives. That is so stupid, and I love it. Alright, thank you. Goodbye. JB or JB now?